are these people?
But this is from Kit Klarenberg. He's doing some stuff in MintPress News this time. And he writes about the Jerusalem conference. You've ever heard about this, Collin? You know,
No.
you heard about the Berlin conference.
You know, most of the things most of the things you pull, I don't know of.
Yep. So there's about Team B in the Jerusalem conference, how Israel helped craft modern day terrorism. So there's been a lot of talks about terrorism, Collin. Like what did we talk about recently? George W. Bush leading a monument in DC about the war on terror. Right. So where do you think we started a lot of that war on terror? Might have been another Bush, like this guy over here. Right. So we're gonna get into it, but this is published November 17th. So not too long ago, but since Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza began, Zionist officials, pundits, journalists, and their Western opposite numbers have endlessly invoked the sinister specter of terrorism to justify the industrial-scale slaughter of Palestinians. It is because of terrorism, twice failed U.S. presidential candidate and unconvicted war criminal Hillary Clinton representatively wrote for The Atlantic on November 14th that Hamas must be permanently erased. Destroyed hospitals and schools and civilians killed en masse are reasonable collateral damage, such as the unparalleled evil of terrorists. Yet, the relentless stream of heartrending clips documenting the Israeli occupation force, Holocaust-deluging social media feeds the world over, and the ever-ratcheting child death toll has compelled countless citizens to ask, if Hamas are terrorists, then what are Zionists? It is surely no coincidence YouTube recently yanked the official video of a groundbreaking track by renowned rapper and MintPress News contributor Low-Key, Terrorist, posing this precise question. Terrorist was released in 2011, at the height of the U.S. empire's war on terror. Then, the purported global threat of terrorism, so this was 2011, this video's been up, Collin. They just now took it down.
Right. And we talked about that with Low-Key, like how they removed
his Spotify stuff. And that's literally the IDF and the ADL working in conjunction to bully Spotify. And he wasn't the only one censored. So the purported global threat of terrorism was exploited throughout the West to savage civil liberties at home and wage relentless illegal military interventions abroad. Mainstream usage of the term precipitously plummeted thereafter. It is only now regaining popular currency due to the Gaza genocide. There is no accident, as we shall see. Israel, and specifically its Western leader Benjamin Netanyahu, was fundamentally to concocting the mainstream conception of terrorism explicitly to delegitimize anti-imperial struggles while validating Western state violence directed at oppressed peoples across the global South. The impact of this informational assault can be felt in every corner of the world, not least Gaza. In fact, one might reasonably conclude the specific foundations of Nakba 2 Electric Boogaloo, which is unfolding in grisly real time right now, were laid decades ago as a result of the conveniences of Netanyahu, the International Zionist Lobby, and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. What follows is the little-known history of how terrorism came to meet a majority of the world's population, the Palestinian people in particular, live with the mephitic consequences every day. So, our story starts 1976, Care Bear, at the peak of detente between the U.S. and Soviet Union, right? After 2.5 decades of bitter enmity, the two superpowers resolved a peaceful coexistence at the start of the decade. They collaborated to systematically dismantle the structures and doctrines that defined the immediate post-World War II era, such as mutually assured destruction. So we're trying to deal with some nukes there, Care Bear. What country also has those? Just if you were to take a guess. But in May of that year, the CIA produced its annual National Intelligence Estimate, a comprehensive report combining data from various intelligence agencies intended to be a basis for crafting foreign policy. In keeping with the past 5 years, it concluded the Soviets were in severe economic decline, favored diplomacy over conflict, and desperately sought an end to the Cold War. Such findings lay behind Washington's push for détente and Moscow's eager acceptance of major disarmament and arms control treaties. However, newly appointed CIA Director George H.W. Bush categorically rejected these conclusions. He sought a second opinion and constructed an independent intelligence cell to review the NIE, known as Team B. It was composed of hardcore Cold Warriors, defense industry-funded hawks, and rabid anti-communists. Among them were several individuals who would become leading figures in the neocon movement, such as Paul Wolfowitz. Also present were the infamous CIA and Pentagon dark arts specialists who've been professionally ostracized due to detente. One of those. Team B duly reviewed the NIE and rubbished each and every one of the agency's findings. Rather than dilapidated, impoverished, and teetering on total collapse, the Soviet Union was, in fact, more deadly and dangerous than ever, having constructed a vast array of first-strike capabilities right under the CIA's collective nose. To reach these bombshell conclusions, Team B relied on a confounding hodgepodge of peculiar logical fallacy, paranoid theorizing, crazed conspiratorial conjecture, unsupported value judgments, amateurish circular reasoning. So, look, there they are. There's HW, Gerald Ford. Look, they're looking over a map of Lebanon right there, Care Bear. Beirut. So, for example, Team B repeatedly assessed that a lack of evidence Moscow possessed weapon systems, military technology, or surveillance capabilities comparable or superior to Washington's own was inverse proof that the Soviets in fact did. They were so sophisticated and innovative, Team B concluded, that they couldn't be detected or even comprehended by the West. Team B's analysis was confirmed to be a total fantasy when the USSR collapsed, yet its methods informed all subsequent NIEs throughout the Cold War and likely endure today. On June 27th of that year, mere weeks after Team B was set to work on reigniting the Cold War, Air France Flight 139, en route to Paris from Tel Aviv, was hijacked by members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Redirected to a Ugandan airport, the plane was greeted on the runway by Idi Amin, military at least, right, who ushered the passengers, the majority of whom were Jewish or Israeli, into the terminal, watched over by scores of soldiers intended to prevent their escape or rescue. The hijackers relayed a demand to the government of Israel. Unless a ransom of $5 million was paid to them and 53 Palestinian prisoners were released from jail, the hostages would be executed. In response, 100 elite IOF commandos launched an audacious action to free the hostages. Their mission, known as the Entebbe Raid, was a stunning success. All but 4 hostages were rescued alive. And the IOF lost just one commander, Yonatan Netanyahu, the older brother of Israel's sitting Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. For years, by that point, Israeli officials have been attempting to popularize the term terrorism to explain the motivations and actions of Palestinian freedom fighters. That way, the religious fury and repression could be reframed as a destructive ideology of violence for violence sake, without rationale, and Zionist colonial tyranny as warranted self-defense. This effort became turbocharged in September 1972 in the kidnapping of 11 Israeli athletes at that year's Olympics in Munich by Palestinian militants, ended with all hostages murdered. You remember that, right? Or at least heard about that. So, what does this bit sound like? This terrorism to explain the motivations and violent for violence sake. You ever heard that phrasing before?
Violence for violence sake.
Yep.
I mean,
yeah, like people are inherently violent in some way.
Well, yeah, I think that's I think people are not necessarily saying that, but that's the stereotypical view of Arabs.
Yep.
Or basically anyone melanated, more or less.
Like,
you know,
sounds of the South and whatnot.
Right.
Song of the
So
South.
most of like Black and Arab people, like the darker you are, the more threatening you are.
Right.
So,
yep.
And more prone to violence, if anything
else.
So,
right. And it's almost like, I don't know if you've ever looked at the Israeli justice system, but it has some parallels to our justice system. It has an 85% conviction rate, Collin. 85%. So that means everyone accused, 85% of them convicted.
Right.
I mean, I don't know about math, but that's a lot. I mean, like 5-year-olds when they're like, which we've been seeing. But I digress. This particularly public bloodshed centered world attention on Israel and left Western citizens wondering what could have possibly inspired such actions. Zionists had hitherto managed to largely conceal their systemic, state-enforced repression and displacement of Palestinians from the outside world. Journalists were kept well away from the scenes of major crimes. At the same time, Amnesty International's Israeli branch was secretly financed and directed by Tel Aviv's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to whitewash facts on the ground. For the Netanyahu family, the Intim parade was a tragedy, but also an ideal opportunity to validate and internationalize the concept of terrorism. As espoused by Zionists in 1979, Benjamin Netanyahu founded the Jonathan Institute in honor of his slain brother. Its purpose, he said, was to focus public attention on the grave threat that international terrorism poses to all democratic societies, to study the real nature of today's terrorism, and to propose measures from combating and defeating the international terror movements. When was this, Collin? 1979. We're almost to the 80s. Okay? So look at this guy in 83. Okay? Little fresh-faced Netanyahu here is explaining what terrorism is not. This is what he thinks is not terrorism. Okay?
Let me try to give an instance of what terrorism is not. In 1944, the British Royal Air Force sets out on a bombing mission. The target is the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen. Perfect target. The planes loose the bombs, drop the bombs, and they miss. Instead of the Gestapo headquarters, they hit a children's hospital, and scores of children are horribly killed. This is an accidental, tragic outcome of war. This can happen, but it is not terrorism.
So,
what was the last part? It's not terrible.
Not terrorism. Is what he says there.
Let me try to give it.
But yeah, essentially stating that if you miss a target and a bomb accidentally falls on a Christian's hospital, it's not terrorism. That's his personal belief. He was relating the British doing that, so they learned it from watching you, Dad. Is what he's saying. So in July that year, the Institute, convened the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism in Jerusalem's Hilton Hotel. It gathered together a 700-strong mob of Israeli government officials, U.S. lawmakers, intelligence operatives from across the Five Eyes global spying network, and Western foreign policy apparatchiks. Hopefully I'm using that right. Perhaps unsurprisingly, apparatchiks. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many representatives of Team B were in attendance. For 4 days and 7 separate sessions, speaker after speaker painted a disturbing picture of the worldwide phenomenon of terrorism. Care Bear. I wonder if something similar might have happened recently with people like Elon Musk and showing them acts of terrorism, quote unquote. It's almost like they've had some practice at this. Yes.
practice. Well, yeah, I mean, especially if APAC is involved.
Yes, yes, it is.
Because I was, unfortunately, I know you're not gonna like this, but I did listen to Briandra Gray, some of her interview with Ryan Grimm, yesterday en route to work, and he mentioned, and we talked about APAC last week, of how their hand is just really deep in terms of the U.S. government. I mean, we saw it today in that resolution that was voted on, that pretty much everybody in the damn House voted for it. And then Tlaib voted present for it, which, but, APAC has had plenty of practice, plenty of money, and plenty of time to really, season their efforts to ensure that, they basically rule Congress.
Yeah.
And the matter of speaking,
It's interesting to see how they're going to spin this in a second, because there's definitely parallels with what they've been doing now about tying it to the quote unquote Soviet Union, right? I guarantee you, if you are pro-Palestinian in any way, you will also be pro-Russian very quickly.
I'm sure.
They unanimously declared that all terrorists constituted a single, organized political movement that was being secretly financed, armed, trained, and directed by the Soviet Union. This devilish nexus, it was claimed, posed a mortal threat to Western democracy, freedom, and security, requiring a coordinated response. Eerily, as academic Diana Rolfe later observed, the JCIT's collective prescription for tackling this purported menace was precisely what transpired just over 2 decades later during the War on Terror, the Gulf War, all that fun stuff. So, this included preemptive attacks on states that are alleged to support terrorists, an elaborate intelligence system apparatus, civil liberties, particularly for Palestinians targeted as potential terrorists, including detention without charge and torture, and propaganda to dehumanize terrorists in the eyes of the public. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin addressed the JCIT's opening session. He set the tone by claiming Western state violence was ultimately a fight for freedom or liberation, and therefore fundamentally opposed to terrorism. He concluded his remarks by imploring the assembled throng to go forth and promote the conference message once it was over, and they did so. So, the only democracy in the Middle East, right, Care Bear? So here he is. This is this conference. Look, it's at the Jerusalem Hilton, Care Bear. Wouldn't you like to stay at that hotel? You think they give good, breakfast in the morning? Probably not, right?
I'm sure for this.
What is the method? Well, see, they are enemies of democracy. And I myself, one of previous underground fighters, state here and now that wherever you can decide issues by the ballot, you must under no circumstances use the bullet from either direction or left, either right or left. Therefore, the New Left, a reactionary dark movement, fights democracy in Italy and in France and in Germany and in Japan and in other countries, but mainly the European countries, in which Jewish blood flew from the Rhine to the Danube and from the Bug to the Volga, with comfort and support to the so-called PLO, the basest armed organization ever.
Do we got to go back for people to see who that was?
To the so-called PLO.
Who's that?
Is that Biden? That almost doesn't look like him.
No, it's not. It's Mr. Hugh Fraser.
The the basest
Okay,
armed
this kind of looked like Biden there.
organization.
If I can catch that card.
It doesn't matter.
Since the days of the Nazis. You cannot expect to overcome your own terrorism if you open offices of the PLO in your capitals, if you accept them into the United Nations, if you give the representative the right to sit around the table of the Security Council,
As far as terrorism is concerned, except in the immediate aftermath of some IRA outrage, we tend to be a nation believing it can't happen here.
He's talking about what? The IRA being a terrorist organization? Yep. When they were definitely a liberation force, you know?
Right. I remember that.
Yep.
As I do, then you must join me in wondering why the community of liberal democracies has not banded together more effectively to oppose these international murders. The PLO attacks against moderate Palestinians, the murder of a moderate leader in the Gaza is a recent brutal example. I can go on and on. My colleagues have given us a good bill of particulars.
His colleagues gave him particulars, Care Bear. So notice they were talking about the PLO there. What did they do about the PLO, Collin? Do you know? We talked about this. They funded a particular group in Gaza to become leader. You know, to combat the
sounds like
secular PLO.
It sounds like a certain spread.
Yes, it does. Yep, that hummus.
And maybe sometimes on.
You know, so among the JCIT attendees were American author and journalist Claire Sterling, who cut her teeth as a reporter decades earlier at the Overseas News Agency, an MI6 propaganda operation. Seeking to boost U.S. public support for entering World War II, following the conference, he frequently amplified the claims of JCIT speakers and articles from prominent newspapers, leading to an epic March 1981 front-page expose of the New York Times. Terrorism, tracing the international network. Okay, so, you know, propaganda goes way back. A book published later that year, The Terror Network, expanded significantly on Sterling's oeuvre and firmly cemented the notion of Moscow as a grand spider sat in the middle of a vast, globe-spanning web of deadly political violence in the Western public mind. It caused a sensation upon release, receiving rave reviews from major news outlets, being translated into 22 languages, Care Bear, and becoming a bestseller in several countries. That book right there, in case you wanted to, you know, pitch it out a window. So, most significantly of all, the Terror Network has a particular potent impact on newly inaugurated President Ronald Reagan and his CIA chief William Casey, committed anti-communists. They entered office desperately seeking a pretext for brutally crushing left-wing nationalist opposition to U.S. imperialism in Latin America. Sterling's work provided ample ammunition for achieving that blood-soaked objective and was key to the White House decisively shattering detent, and process began by Team 5 years earlier. Consequently, the Terror Network was circulated among U.S. lawmakers and heavily promoted overseas on the Reagan administration's dime. Casey furthermore tasked his agency with verifying its thesis. They quickly assessed Sterling's work to be irredeemable garbage. Okay? This is their agency. Ironically enough, it was heavily influenced by CIA black propaganda. Enraged, Casey demanded the evaluation be revised. An updated appraisal was less scathing, but nonetheless stressed the book was uneven and the reliability of its sources varies widely, while significant portions were incorrect. Still dissatisfied, Casey asked a CIA senior review panel charged with scrutinizing Langley's former estimates to write their own report on the subject. They concluded the Soviets did offer limited financial material and practical assistance to a handful of anti-imperial Global South liberation movements, some of which were labeled terrorist by Western powers. But there was insufficient evidence of Muscovite culpability for the entire global phenomenon of terrorism, yet alone funding and directing such entities as dedicated policy. So they're saying that it's full of shit, this whole premise.
Yeah.
So, undeterred, when Casey personally delivered the report to Reagan, he allegedly said of its findings, "Of course, Mr. President, you and I know better." So it was CIA-backed death squads that ran roughshod across Washington's backyard throughout the 1980s in the name of neutralizing Soviet influence in the region. Their actions were heavily informed by the agency's guerrilla warfare manual, which encouraged assassinations of government officials and civilian leaders and deadly attacks on soft targets, such as schools and hospitals. Sounds familiar. Terrorism, in other words. So, another example of Reagan's terrorism was sponsoring Afghanistan's Mujahideen resistance fighters in their battle with, ironically enough, the Soviet Red Army. This policy endured after the evil empire was vanquished. The same militants were transported to Bosnia and Kosovo in the 1990s to aid and abet the painful, forced death of Yugoslavia. Okay? So, in case people forget what those guys became, that's called Al-Qaeda now. In case people forgot. So, when these covert actions produced blowback in the form of the 9/11 attacks, well, we couldn't possibly remember why they'd be upset, Care Bear. Why would they ever do this? That is, if you believe they did it, which you shouldn't. Right. You shouldn't do that. Several individuals who attended the JCIT and their acolytes were elevated to the Bush administration due to their supposed terrorism expertise. Meanwhile, with public and state-level fears of terrorism ramping up significantly the world over, many Western countries turned to Israel for advice and guidance on how to tackle the issue. As Netanyahu commented in 2008, we are benefiting, and I'm going to say this a couple of times so people get this. We are benefiting from one thing. This is Netanyahu. And that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. That's Benjamin Netanyahu saying Israel benefits from the Twin Towers being blown up. Okay? Just if we want to, just a very shallow level of this rabbit hole you can go down. There's a video by Joe, shut the fuck up shitlib, on, on a particular country doing 9/11. It's on Twitter. Go find that. It's like 30 minutes. Please watch it. Share it with your friends. This is not only because 9/11 swung American public opinion in Israel's favor. In a blink, Zionist repression and slaughter were transformed from a source of international embarrassment and obloquy into a compelling sales pitch and unique selling point for Tel Aviv's welter of defense and security firms. The occupied territory became laboratories, their inhabitants test subjects, upon whom new weaponry, surveillance methods, and pacification techniques could be trialed by the IOF. He means the IDF, but he's making a point. Then marketed and sold overseas. It is not for nothing The graphic videos showing IDF surgical strikes on Palestinians, their homes, schools, and hospitals are proudly displayed at international arms fairs and private demonstrations of invasive surveillance tools such as Pegasus routinely wow repressive foreign security intelligence agencies behind closed doors. On top of a significant financial benefit, there is a diplomatic dividend to Israel secures an invaluable censor-stifling goodwill from customers, therefore permitting the Zionist project of permanently purging Palestine of its indigenous inhabitants to persist untrampled. We see a palpable demonstration of this currently, while the streets of almost every major Western city have regularly teemed with pro-Palestine fervor ever since the latest attack on Gaza began. The protesters' elected representatives are at best silent, at worst, actively complicit. Impassioned chants of "We are all Palestinians" have been a frequent fixture at these events. This rallying call is highly apposite, for in addition to expressing sympathy and solidarity with the Palestinian people, it is urgently incumbent upon us all to reflect that the very same techniques and technologies of control and oppression to which they have been so cruelly subjected daily for decades have firmly trained on us as well. As a result of Israel's invention of terrorism, as such, it is no exaggeration to say Palestinians are canaries in the coal mine of humanity. Care Bear, thoughts?
Yes, sir. Ay. I mean,
yep.
The rabbit hole goes deep with Israel. I think
and the
we
war
might
on
have
terror.
to do a separate. I think we have to do a separate playlist on what we've talked about on Israel over the last few weeks, because it just proves that it's a lot deeper. It just, even with the history that I think a lot of people already know, but it's just so much more to it.
Yeah, there's decades. There's decades of this. You know,
well, I think, given the history in terms of Zionism and how that plays out, but I think even thinking in not so recent history, just within the last 40 years, how they've been able to shift this idea, and like basically they, thanks to Bibi, just redefine what terrorism is for their benefit. And,
not just redefined, again, they defined it. Like,
right.
For us.
But again, right. And again, I have to say, like, Bibi met with AIPAC this week.
Recently.
Was it?
And Elon.
Yeah,
and
recently.
Which we know Elon. So Elon is letting a Israeli tech firm run his verification process now. So you got to give some Israeli company your data. I mean, it's, those fingers are everywhere. They're everywhere. And so there's a, so it's just, there's really a video game.
Go ahead.
And it's, I don't even know if you want to call it a video game. It's Hearts of Iron, what it's called. And it's essentially like you get to run a country in World War II. Right. And it starts just before the war. Right. So there's a part of that game where it's all, you get to send envoys, right? You get to leave dissidents in the countries and try to sway public opinion, right? So that, I don't know, let's say you wanted a fascist New Zealand, that's possible if you go through all these steps, right? It's just an interesting way to think about that. That's what the Israelis have been doing. After the war, they've been sending a ton of lobbying and propagandists and people supportive of their cause, so that, every politician and businessman and whatever is heavily connected, and they just have ears in the room. it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. It's literally just, you know, access and connection and power and money and trust, like standard stuff that we've been dealing with since. It's like I feel like a lot of our brothers and sisters woke up during that war on terror because it was so blatant, thanks to Julian Assange, that they were lying to us the whole time, you know?
Right.
And then before that, it was the Cold War, where people found out your government was lying to you the whole time. So it's just more of the same. So start there, start with how they're lying to you, and then go from there. So, you know, follow the money. Not hard. Usually it ends up being over resources. So, but anyway, anything to add?
Really, no, I think it's, as I said, it's just really mind-blowing how sticky the hand is with the Israel lobby and just how all of these connections. I think, you know, you can argue really going back to the turn of the century and how they've had the time to really perfect their craft, essentially, to, you know, where we are now. It just makes me think if the Arab lobby, you know, which, to be fair, I think in regards to voting, you know, against Biden now, I've seen a lot more
that bloc be
Arab
a bigger problem. Yeah.
Bloc being, well, I think, you know, I just think in terms more on protests, you know,
Yeah.
like they're
But
more or less being mobilized.
You're seeing some of the Democrats
to,
go, hey guys, brown people might not like us right now. Like,
right.
that's pretty much it, which I find fucking despicable, because it's like, you don't give a fuck about the issue. You care about how the issue affects your voting potential. Like, you know, fuck you. But
right. But I wonder, and I wonder if there's someone we could talk more about this, is the idea of like, could these Arab organizations, like, what would need to be done? Because at the end of the day, this all involves money. Like, you could say, oh, I'm not going to vote for the duopoly all you want.
Well, this is the thing.
Without the money,
those lanes are open, just not with our country. They're already going to other countries for that support. So,
right. But without the money kind of backing that,
yeah,
you know, it's going to be like, we're still going to have to deal with the Israel lobby, you know, for the foreseeable future. So I just wonder if there's someone we could talk to just to kind of see the viability of what is happening from what I'm kind of seeing online.
Well, you're seeing a lot of economic things happening.
Being more organized to counter AIPAC. I don't think so, but I think at minimum being able to kind of throw a wrench into like some of this planning and kind of this, you know, I mean, I imagine it would be extremely difficult given the practice the lobbyists had and the kind of influence they have over pretty much everyone in government. But something has to be done. I think just in general to kind of think about getting money out of politics, but obviously the Israel lobby is like the biggest dealer here, or if not among the biggest. So how to counter that?
Well, and you're seeing,
not even speaking on the grassroots, but not just even like on the grassroots level, but financially.
Yeah.
How you're going to how can we counter like the money and influence that does exist within that?
Yep. Well, I'm sure we'll be talking more about this very stuff